The soldier stood at the edge of the battlefield, his armor scorched and dented from hours of relentless combat. The air was thick with the acrid smell of plasma fire and charred earth, a testament to the ferocity of the alien invasion that had swept across the planet like a tidal wave. He adjusted the grip on his rifle, his fingers trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. His unit had been decimated. Only he remained, the last human standing against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. Above him, the sky churned with unnatural hues, streaked with violet and emerald clouds that pulsed as though alive. The alien ships hung in orbit like predatory birds, their sleek forms casting ominous shadows over the ravaged landscape. It was said that these invaders came from a distant galaxy, led by an empire older than humanity itself. They called themselves the Veth, a race of beings whose technology and power far outstripped anything Earth could muster. And yet, despite their overwhelming superiority, they had not obliterated humanity outright. Instead, they waged war with calculated precision, as if testing the limits of human resilience. The soldier's name was Kale, though it felt irrelevant now. In this moment, he was merely a cog in a machine that refused to stop grinding. He glanced down at his hands, calloused and scarred, stained with dirt and blood, not all of it his own. Each wound told a story. The time he'd shielded a child during an ambush, the desperate melee where he'd fought off 3 Veth warriors with nothing but a knife, the countless skirmishes where survival had been measured in seconds rather than minutes. He didn't know why he kept fighting. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was something deeper, a stubborn refusal to let go of hope, even when everything around him screamed that there was none left. As Kale scanned the horizon, his ears picked up a faint hum, growing louder with each passing second. His heart sank. That sound meant only one thing: reinforcements were coming. But not for him, for them. Another wave of Veth soldiers would descend upon the battlefield, and this time there would be no escape. Still, he raised his weapon, bracing himself for what was to come. If death awaited him, so be it. At least he would face it on his feet, defiant until the end. But then, something unexpected happened. The hum shifted, becoming less mechanical and more deliberate. From the swirling chaos above, a single vessel descended, its shape unlike any other ship Kale had seen before. It was sleek and organic, resembling a living creature more than a machine. Its surface shimmered with iridescent colors that seemed to shift depending on the angle of light. As it hovered just above the ground, a hatch opened, revealing a figure bathed in soft, golden light. Kale squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure stepped forward, her presence commanding attention without effort. She was tall, taller than most humans, with skin that glowed faintly, as though infused with starlight. Her eyes were large and almond-shaped, pools of liquid silver that reflected the turmoil of the world around her. Her hair cascaded down her back in waves of midnight black, interwoven with strands that sparkled like diamonds. She wore an intricate suit of armor, its design both elegant and intimidating, adorned with symbols Kale couldn't decipher but somehow understood carried immense significance. For a moment, Kale thought she might be some kind of elite warrior, sent to finish him off. But there was something about her demeanor that defied such assumptions. She moved with grace and purpose, her every step radiating authority. When she spoke, her voice was melodic yet firm, carrying a weight that resonated deep within Kale's chest. "You," she said simply, her gaze locking onto his. "Come with me." Kale blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "What?" he managed to croak, his throat dry from hours of shouting orders and firing his weapon. "You are needed," she continued, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Resistance is futile." He wanted to laugh, to tell her that resistance was all he had left. But something stopped him. There was an intensity in her gaze, a certainty that made his instincts scream at him to obey. Against every fiber of logic, he found himself lowering his rifle and stepping toward her. The moment he did, the ship behind her emitted a low thrum, enveloping them both in a cocoon of light. Before Kale could process what was happening, the battlefield disappeared, replaced by the sterile interior of the alien vessel. The transition was disorienting, to say the least. One moment, Kale was standing amidst the ruins of his world, and the next, he was surrounded by walls that seemed to breathe, pulsating softly with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The air smelled clean, almost too pure, and the temperature was perfectly balanced. Not too hot, not too cold. Everything about the environment felt alien yet strangely comforting, as if the ship itself was alive and aware of his presence. His captor, or savior, depending on how one looked at it, turned to face him, her silver eyes studying him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "Who are you?" Kale asked finally, his voice steadier than he expected. "And why am I here?" Her lips curved into a faint smile, though it held little warmth. "I am Empress Silren of the veth Dominion," she replied, her words flowing like music. "And you, human, have been chosen." "Chosen?" Kale echoed, incredulous. "For what? To be interrogated? Executed? Used as some kind of bargaining chip?" Silren tilted her head slightly, as if considering his questions. "None of those things," she said after a pause. "You have been selected for a purpose far greater than you can comprehend. Your species' resilience, your capacity for adaptation and survival, it intrigues us. You, in particular, stand out among your kind." Kale frowned, shaking his head. "You're making no sense. Why me? I'm just a soldier. A grunt. Nothing special." "On the contrary," Silren countered, taking a step closer. Her proximity was unnerving. She radiated an aura of power that made Kale feel small despite his height. "Your actions during this conflict have been observed. Your courage, your loyalty, your willingness to sacrifice yourself for others, they are qualities we value highly. Qualities that align with our needs." "Our needs," Kale repeated, his voice rising slightly. "What does any of this have to do with me? What do you want from me?" Silren regarded him silently for a long moment before answering. "To ensure the continuation of my lineage," she said simply. "To strengthen the bond between our peoples. To secure peace." Kale stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. "Wait, you mean, you want me to—" he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "Yes," Silren confirmed, her expression unreadable. "You will become my consort. My mate." The room seemed to spin around Kale as her words sank in. Consort. Mate. The idea was absurd. Impossible. Yet here he was, standing aboard an alien spacecraft, facing a being who claimed to rule an entire empire, and she wanted him. Of all people. "This has to be a joke," he muttered under his breath, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" "It is no jest," Silren said sharply, her tone cutting through his disbelief. "This decision was not made lightly. My advisors have analyzed countless candidates, weighing their strengths and weaknesses. You were deemed the most suitable." "But why?" Kale demanded, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why pick someone like me? Someone who doesn't even understand what's going on? Shouldn't you choose someone smarter, stronger, better equipped to deal with whatever this is?" Silren's gaze softened ever so slightly, though her posture remained rigid. "Strength comes in many forms, Kale. Yours lies not in physical prowess alone but in your spirit. Your determination. Your ability to endure. These traits are rare, even among my own kind. And they are essential for what lies ahead." Kale opened his mouth to argue further, but the words caught in his throat. For all his confusion and anger, there was a part of him that couldn't deny the truth in her words. He had endured. He had fought when others would have given up. But that didn't explain why anyone, would see him as worthy of such an honor. Or burden, depending on how one looked at it. "I don't belong here," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "I'm nobody. Just a guy trying to survive." "You underestimate yourself," Silren replied, her voice tinged with something akin to admiration. "That is why you were chosen." Kale sat alone in the chamber assigned to him, the walls pulsing gently as though the ship itself was alive and breathing. The silence pressed heavily against him, amplifying the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. He tried to piece together the fragments of what had transpired, searching for logic in the illogical. How could he, a mere soldier, have been plucked from the brink of destruction to serve as the mate of an alien empress? The notion was preposterous, yet undeniably real. every detail. The glowing eyes of Empress, the strange, organic architecture of the ship, the sheer magnitude of her declaration, confirmed that this was no hallucination. This was his reality now, whether he liked it or not. His emotions churned like a storm-tossed sea. Anger flared first, sharp and unrelenting. How dare they take him from his world, from his comrades, from the fight he had sworn to see through to the end. He clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening as he imagined confronting Silren again, demanding answers she hadn't given before. But beneath the anger lay a deeper, more insidious feeling. Fear. Fear of the unknown, of what lay ahead, of the expectations placed upon him. What did it mean to be the consort of an alien ruler? Would he be forced to abandon his humanity entirely, to become something he didn't recognize? The weight of the responsibility threatened to crush him. Yet, intertwined with the anger and fear was a flicker of curiosity, reluctant but persistent. Silren's words echoed in his mind. Your spirit. Your determination. Your ability to endure. Could it be true? Had he truly possessed qualities that set him apart, even in the eyes of beings as advanced as the veth? The thought unsettled him, not because it was flattering but because it forced him to confront a version of himself he barely understood. Was he more than the sum of his scars and battles? More than the soldier who followed orders and fought to survive? The questions gnawed at him, each one opening a new fissure in his resolve. He thought of Earth, of the friends he had lost and the home he might never see again. Guilt surged within him, sharp and biting. How could he accept this fate while others continued to suffer and die? What right did he have to be spared when so many had perished? The faces of his fallen comrades haunted him, their voices whispering accusations he couldn't silence. He buried his face in his hands, trying to steady his breathing, but the guilt only grew heavier, pressing down on his chest until it felt hard to breathe. And then there was Silren herself. Try as he might, Kale couldn't dismiss her entirely. There was something about her, an undeniable magnetism that drew him in despite his resistance. Her presence commanded respect, her words carried weight, and her gaze seemed to pierce straight through him, exposing vulnerabilities he didn't want to acknowledge. He hated the effect she had on him, the way she made him question everything he thought he knew. Was she manipulating him, playing on his emotions to secure his compliance? Or was there sincerity in her intentions, however alien they might seem? Kale rose abruptly, pacing the confines of the chamber in an attempt to shake off the suffocating mix of emotions. The movement did little to ease his turmoil, but it gave him something to focus on besides the chaos in his mind. He needed clarity, a way to make sense of the situation, but the answers eluded him. All he had were questions, endless and unrelenting, each one pulling him in a different direction. Who was he now? What was expected of him? And perhaps most importantly, why had she chosen him? The uncertainty gnawed at him, a relentless ache that refused to fade. For the first time in his life, Kale felt utterly adrift, untethered from everything he had once known. The soldier who had faced death without flinching now found himself paralyzed by doubt, caught between the past he couldn't return to and a future he couldn't comprehend. As the hours dragged on, the ship's rhythmic hum became a constant companion, a reminder of the vastness of space and the enormity of what lay ahead. Kale eventually sank back onto the floor, leaning against the pulsating wall as exhaustion overtook him. Sleep came reluctantly, fragmented by dreams of glowing eyes and whispered promises. When he woke, the questions remained, unresolved and unrelenting, echoing in the silence like a ghost he couldn't escape. Days passed aboard the veth vessel, though Kale had no way of measuring time beyond the ship's subtle rhythms. Silren visited him intermittently, her presence both a comfort and a torment. Each encounter left him more conflicted than the last, her words weaving a tapestry of possibility and dread that he couldn't unravel. She spoke of her empire, of its history and its ambitions, painting a picture of a civilization far older and more complex than humanity. She described rituals and traditions that spanned millennia, ceremonies steeped in symbolism and meaning. And always, she returned to the same point, his role in it all. "You will be tested," she told him during one of their meetings, her tone grave. "Not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The bond between us must be unbreakable, forged in trust and mutual understanding. If you fail..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Kale didn't need her to. The implication hung heavy in the air, a threat wrapped in velvet. Failure wasn't an option, not if he wanted to survive, or if he wanted to protect whatever remnants of humanity still clung to existence. The weight of the responsibility pressed down on him, suffocating in its enormity. Between these visits, Cale spent his time exploring the ship, though his movements were restricted to certain areas. The corridors twisted and turned like veins in a living organism, their surfaces shifting subtly under his touch. He marveled at the technology, which seemed to respond to his presence, lighting pathways and opening doors as though anticipating his needs. Despite his initial resistance, he couldn't help but feel a grudging awe at the sophistication of it all. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered, a blend of artistry and engineering that defied comprehension. Yet, for all its wonders, the ship was isolating. The crew, if there was one, remained unseen, their duties carried out silently and efficiently. Cale saw no other veth beyond Silren herself, and the absence of interaction left him feeling like a specimen under observation. He began to wonder if he was truly a guest or a prisoner, his freedom an illusion maintained to keep him compliant. The thought gnawed at him, feeding into the paranoia that had taken root in his mind. During one of his solitary walks, Cale stumbled upon a chamber unlike any he had seen before. Its walls shimmered with holographic projections, depicting scenes of battle and triumph, moments frozen in time. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, atop which rested a crystalline orb pulsing with light. Drawn by an inexplicable force, Cale approached it cautiously, his hand hovering inches away. The moment he touched the orb, images flooded his mind, visions of planets consumed by war, civilizations rising and falling, and a lone figure standing amidst the chaos. The figure turned to face him, and Cale realized with a start that it was Silren. The visions ended as abruptly as they had begun, leaving him breathless and disoriented. He staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he just witnessed? Was it a glimpse into the past, or something else entirely? The questions multiplied, each one more unsettling than the last. He left the chamber shaken, the memory of the orb lingering in his mind like a phantom. When Silren appeared later that day, Cale confronted her about the visions. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "What did you show me?" Her expression softened, though her eyes remained guarded. "Memories," she said simply. "Fragments of my journey, my struggles. I thought it important for you to understand the weight of what lies ahead." "And what exactly does lie ahead?" Cale shot back, his frustration boiling over. "You keep talking about bonds and tests and responsibilities, but you never explain anything. How am I supposed to prepare for something I don't even understand?" Silren hesitated, her gaze dropping momentarily before meeting his again. "Because preparation isn't enough," she admitted. "This is not a task you can train for or study. It requires something deeper, a willingness to embrace the unknown, to let go of who you were and become something new." Her words struck a chord within him, resonating with the doubts and fears he had been grappling with since his arrival. Letting go of who he was, it sounded simple, but the implications were staggering. Could he do it? Could he shed the identity he had built over years of hardship and loss, the armor of resilience and defiance that had kept him alive? And if he did, what would remain? The questions swirled in his mind, unanswered and unanswerable. As the days stretched on, Cale found himself caught in a liminal space, neither fully human nor fully veth, tethered to two worlds that seemed irreconcilable. The uncertainty was maddening, a constant itch he couldn't scratch. Yet, amid the chaos, a fragile thread of acceptance began to form, tentative but persistent. Perhaps, he thought, understanding wasn't the key. Perhaps it was trust in himself, in Silren, in the strange path fate had carved for him. But trust was easier said than done, especially when the stakes were as high as they were now. Each step forward felt like walking a tightrope, the abyss yawning wide beneath him. And somewhere in the distance, the echoes of his old life whispered reminders of what he stood to lose. The day of the ceremony arrived without warning, announced by a sudden shift in the ship's atmosphere. The walls pulsed with a deeper, richer glow, and the air seemed charged with anticipation. Cale was summoned to a grand hall he had never seen before, its ceiling arching impossibly high, adorned with constellations that shimmered as though alive. The floor beneath his feet was smooth and cool, etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when he moved. At the far end of the hall stood Silren, resplendent in ceremonial armor that gleamed with an inner light. Around her, figures cloaked in flowing robes formed a semicircle, their faces obscured by masks that mirrored the stars above. Cale's heart pounded as he approached, his steps hesitant yet deliberate. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, each breath feeling heavier than the last. He glanced at Silren, seeking some sign of reassurance, but her expression was unreadable, her silver eyes reflecting the solemnity of the occasion. When he reached her side, she extended a hand, her touch surprisingly warm despite the chill of the surroundings. Without a word, she guided him to the center of the hall, where a pedestal awaited, crowned with another crystalline orb similar to the one he had encountered before. The ceremony began with a low chant, the voices of the robed figures blending into a haunting melody that resonated deep within Cale's chest. The sound was unfamiliar yet strangely comforting, as if it carried the collective wisdom of countless generations. Silren raised her free hand, and the orb on the pedestal began to glow, casting beams of light that intertwined with the constellations above. The light enveloped them both, bathing the hall in a radiant brilliance that seemed to transcend the physical realm. "This bond," Silren intoned, her voice amplified by the resonance of the chant, "is sacred. It binds not just two souls but two destinies, two peoples. Through it, we forge a bridge between worlds, a union that transcends division." Cale listened, his mind struggling to process the gravity of her words. The light intensified, and he felt a strange sensation coursing through him, as though threads of energy were weaving themselves into his very essence. He wanted to resist, to pull away, but Silren's grip on his hand was firm, grounding him. Her gaze locked onto his, and for the first time, he saw vulnerability in her eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that mirrored his own. "Do you accept this bond?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost intimate. "Do you pledge yourself to this union, knowing the sacrifices it will demand?" Cale hesitated, the enormity of the question threatening to overwhelm him. Acceptance meant surrendering everything he had ever known, stepping into a future he couldn't predict. Yet, rejection meant abandoning the fragile connection he had begun to form with Silren, severing the tenuous thread of trust that had started to grow between them. He searched her face, looking for answers in the depths of her silver eyes, but found only reflection, his own doubts and hopes staring back at him. He began, his voice faltering. The chant swelled around him, urging him forward, pulling him toward a decision he wasn't sure he was ready to make. His thoughts raced, torn between the fear of losing himself and the desire to embrace something greater. The light pulsed brighter, the pressure building until it felt like it would consume him whole. In that moment, Cale realized he had no choice. The bond was already forming, its tendrils wrapping around his soul, binding him to Silren in ways he couldn't undo. Whether he accepted it willingly or not, the connection was inevitable. And so, with a deep breath, he nodded, his voice steadying as he spoke. "I accept." The hall erupted in a symphony of light and sound, the constellations above swirling into a vortex of color and energy. Cale felt a surge of power course through him, both exhilarating and terrifying. For a brief instant, he glimpsed fragments of Silren's consciousness, her memories, her fears, her dreams, all intertwined with his own. The experience was overwhelming, a kaleidoscope of emotions and sensations that left him reeling. When the light finally dimmed and the chanting ceased, Cale found himself kneeling, his body trembling with exhaustion. Silren knelt beside him, her hands still clasped tightly in his. Her expression was one of quiet triumph, tempered by a hint of relief. Around them, the robed figures bowed low, their masks reflecting the fading glow of the orb. "You are mine now," Silren whispered, her voice carrying a weight that resonated in Cale's very core. "And I am yours." Cale didn't respond immediately, his mind still grappling with the aftermath of the ceremony. The bond between them was undeniable, a tangible force that pulsed with every beat of his heart. Yet, even as he acknowledged its presence, a shadow of unease lingered at the edges of his awareness. What had he truly agreed to? What sacrifices awaited him in the days to come? Cale's unease grew in the days following the ceremony. The bond with Silren was undeniable, a constant presence that hummed beneath his skin like an electric current. It connected them on a level he couldn't fully comprehend, Her emotions brushed against his consciousness, her thoughts occasionally spilling into his mind unbidden. At times, it felt intimate, almost comforting, as though he had gained a partner who truly understood him. But at other moments, it was suffocating, a reminder of how much control she wielded over this new reality they shared. Silren, for her part, seemed both pleased and cautious. She spent more time with him now, guiding him through the intricacies of veth culture and preparing him for his role as her consort. Yet there were moments when Kale caught glimpses of vulnerability in her, a flicker of doubt in her silver eyes or a hesitation in her voice. He realized then that she wasn't immune to fear either. She too was stepping into uncharted territory, risking everything for a union that defied tradition. One evening, as they stood together on a balcony overlooking the endless expanse of space, Kale finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at him. "Why me?" he asked softly, breaking the silence between them. "Out of everyone, why did you choose me?" Silren turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. For a moment, she didn't speak, as if weighing her words carefully. Then she said, "Because you are different. You carry within you something rare, a resilience not born of strength alone but of compassion. I have seen countless warriors, strategists, leaders among my own kind and others. But none possess what you do, the ability to endure without losing your humanity." Her answer unsettled him, not because it was unexpected but because it struck a chord deep within him. He had always prided himself on his toughness, his refusal to give up no matter the odds. But hearing her describe it as compassion made him see himself in a new light. Was that really what set him apart? Or was she seeing something in him that didn't exist? "And what happens now?" he pressed, his voice tinged with apprehension. "What does being your consort mean for me, for us?" "It means we must navigate this path together," she replied, her gaze steady. "There will be challenges, resistance from those who question our bond. My people are not easily swayed by change, and many will see you as unworthy. But if we stand united, we can forge a future where peace is possible, not just between our peoples but within ourselves." Her words carried conviction, yet Kale couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back. There was a weight in her tone, a shadow of uncertainty that hinted at trials far greater than she let on. Still, he nodded, choosing to trust her, for now. As the days turned into weeks, Kale began to adapt to his new life aboard the ship. He learned the customs of the veth, their rituals and ceremonies, their language and history. Slowly, he started to feel less like an outsider and more like a participant in their world. And while the bond with Silren remained complex, it also deepened, allowing him glimpses into her soul that left him awestruck. She was not merely an empress. She was a woman burdened by duty, driven by a desire to protect her people even at great personal cost. But the peace they found was fragile. News reached them of unrest among the veth ranks, whispers of rebellion brewing against the idea of a human consort. Some saw Kale as a threat to their empire's purity, a symbol of weakness in their leader. Silren dismissed these concerns publicly, but privately, Kale could feel her anxiety growing. The bond between them ensured he shared in her fears, her determination to prove the doubters wrong. One night, as they prepared for sleep in their shared quarters, Kale reached out to her, his hand brushing hers. "You don't have to face this alone," he said quietly. "Whatever comes next, we'll handle it together." Silren looked at him, her silver eyes softening. "Thank you," she murmured, leaning into his touch. "I chose you because I believed in your strength. Now, I believe in us." Their lips met in a tender kiss, a fleeting moment of connection amidst the chaos. In that instant, Kale felt a spark of hope, a belief that perhaps they could overcome anything as long as they stood side by side. The next morning, however, brought news that shattered their fragile calm. A fleet of rebel ships had emerged from the edges of veth space, led by one of Silren's former advisors who sought to overthrow her rule. They demanded Kale's exile, or worse, and vowed to destroy anyone who stood in their way. Silren summoned Kale to the command center, her demeanor resolute despite the tension radiating off her. "We cannot avoid conflict any longer," she said grimly. "They will come for us, and we must be ready." Kale clenched his fists, determination hardening his features. "Then let's show them what we're made of." Together, they prepared for battle, rallying the loyalist forces and devising strategies to defend their position. As the rebel fleet approached, Kale found himself standing beside Silren on the bridge of the ship, his heart pounding with anticipation. This was it, the moment that would define their future. The battle that followed was fierce and unrelenting. Explosions lit up the void of space as ships clashed in a dazzling display of firepower. Kale fought alongside Silren, his human instincts complementing her tactical brilliance. Through the bond, they moved as one, anticipating each other's actions with uncanny precision. Yet, as the tide of the battle shifted in their favor, a critical moment arose. A rebel vessel targeted the command center, its weapons locked onto their position. Without hesitation, Kale stepped forward, placing himself between Silren and the incoming attack. Time seemed to slow as he braced for impact, his mind flashing with memories of Earth, of the life he had left behind. But the blow never came. Silren unleashed a surge of energy from her hands, deflecting the attack and saving them both. Her strength astonished him, but so did the look of anguish in her eyes as she realized the lengths he was willing to go to protect her. When the battle ended, the rebels defeated and their leader captured, Kale collapsed to his knees, exhausted but alive. Silren knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she cupped his face. "You fool," she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. "You could have died." "I couldn't lose you," he replied hoarsely, his voice barely audible. "Not after everything we've been through." In that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of war, they embraced, their bond stronger than ever. They had faced death and emerged victorious, not as empress and consort, but as equals bound by love and sacrifice. And though the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, they knew one thing for certain: as long as they had each other, they could face anything.